On the morning of October 30th, 2018, correctional officers at USP Hazelton in West Virginia made a discovery that would shake the entire federal prison system to its foundation. James Whitey Bulger, one of the most feared organized crime bosses in American history, was found dead in his cell less than 24 hours after arriving at the facility. He had been beaten so severely that his eyes had been targeted, a signature of mob punishment killings. The man who had evaded the FBI for 16 years, who had corrupted federal agents, who had ordered the murders of 19 people, had been killed inside a federal prison in under 12 hours. What happened that night inside USP Hazelton was not random prison violence. It was organized, it was planned. No, and the evidence suggests it was allowed to happen. Which raises a question the federal government has never fully answered. Who wanted Whitey Bulger dead? And who made sure he got there in time to be killed? To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who Whitey Bulger really was. Because the man who died on that prison floor was not just a criminal. He was one of the most dangerous and politically connected figures in 20th century American crime. If you want the real stories, the ones the system tried to bury, subscribe right now. Every week we go deeper inside the truth. James Joseph Bulger Jr. was born in 1929 in Dorchester, Massachusetts, a working-class Irish Catholic neighborhood in South Boston that produced some of the most hardened criminals in New England history. From the beginning, Bulger was not simply a product of his environment. He was a student of it. By his teenage years, Bulger was already running with street gangs, committing armed robberies, and studying the mechanics of organized crime with the focus of a man who intended to run it one day. He was first arrested at 13. By his early 20s, he had already served time in federal prison for bank robbery, including a stretch at Alcatraz and Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Prison did not reform Bulger. It educated him. He studied other criminals, learned organizational structure, and returned to South Boston in the early 1960s with a clarity of purpose that would define the next 4 decades of his life. He was going to take over the Winter Hill Gang, and then he was going to take over Boston. By the 1970s, Bulger had done exactly that. The Winter Hill Gang, under his leadership, controlled loan sharking, extortion, drug trafficking, and gambling across South Boston and beyond. He was ruthless, strategic, and, as federal investigators would later discover, protected by someone inside the FBI itself. In 1975, Bulger became an FBI informant, handled personally by Special Agent John Connolly, a South Boston native who had grown up idolizing Bulger. The relationship that followed was one of the most corrupt in FBI history. Bulger fed Connolly information on the Italian mob. Connolly fed Bulger the names of informants inside the Winter Hill Gang, men who were then murdered. For over a decade, Whitey Bulger operated with near total immunity. The FBI protected him. Local law enforcement was either corrupt or outmaneuvered. And Bulger, knowing exactly how protected he was, became more violent, more territorial, and more dangerous than anyone in New England organized crime had ever been. He is officially linked to 19 murders, though investigators believe the true number is significantly higher. His victims included women. One was strangled with her own shoelace. Another was buried in a location that took investigators years to find. Bulger did not just kill people who threatened his operation. He killed people to send messages, to maintain fear, and sometimes simply because he wanted to. In 1994, an informant tipped Bulger that federal indictments were coming. He was warned 48 hours before his arrest by his FBI handler. On the night of January 5, 1995, the FBI arrived at his apartment in South Boston. Whitey Bulger was gone. He would not be found for 16 years. For over a decade and a half, Bulger lived under a false identity in Santa Monica, California, hiding in plain sight in a beachfront apartment with his long-term girlfriend, Catherine Gregg. The FBI named him to their 10 Most Wanted list. A $2 million reward was offered. He was featured on America's Most Wanted. None of it produced a result, until a tip from Iceland led investigators to his door in June 2011. When agents knocked on the door of apartment 303 at the Princess Eugenia complex in Santa Monica, Bulger answered. He was 81 years old, white-haired and lean, but his pale blue eyes were as sharp and scanning as they had always been. He was taken into custody without incident. Inside the apartment, investigators found 30 firearms and over $822,000 in cash hidden inside the walls. At trial in 2013, Bulger was convicted on 31 counts, including 11 murders. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, plus 5 years. He showed no visible emotion at sentencing, the same controlled stillness that had defined him for 8 decades. He was sent to USP Coleman, 2 in Florida, to begin serving his sentence. This story gets darker from here. Drop a comment. Did the federal system fail, or did someone inside it make a decision? We want to know what you think. Inside Coleman II, Bulger's reputation preceded him completely. Other inmates knew exactly who he was. Staff monitored him closely. Despite his age and physical condition, he had a heart condition and required a wheelchair at times. His presence in any facility carried weight that no amount of frailty could diminish. Their prison intelligence reports indicated that Bulger's history as an FBI informant, a fact made fully public during his trial, made him a marked man inside the federal system. In prison culture, informants occupy the lowest position in the hierarchy. But Bulger was not simply an informant. He was the informant who had gotten people killed by passing names to the FBI. That carried a specific kind of sentence inside prison walls. For several years inside Coleman, Bulger remained relatively stable. He filed legal motions. He corresponded with journalists and researchers. He gave carefully worded statements about his case. He maintained the controlled and strategic communication style that had defined his entire criminal career, even now, even at 85 years old, inside a federal prison cell. Then in October 2018, without clear public explanation, the Bureau of Prisons transferred Whitey Bulger from USP Coleman, 2 in Florida, to USP Hazelton in West Virginia. The transfer was approved and processed through standard federal channels. It appeared routine on paper. It was anything but. USP Hazelton had a documented reputation inside the federal prison system that made the transfer decision impossible to explain away. The facility had been flagged repeatedly for severe understaffing, extreme gang activity, and an unusually high rate of violent incidents. In the 2 years before Bulger's arrival, multiple inmates had been killed inside its walls, and staff openly referred to it as Misery Mountain. Multiple prison staff members and criminal justice officials later stated publicly that transferring an 89-year-old high-profile informant to USP Hazelton was not a bureaucratic oversight. It was, in their words, a death sentence in paperwork form. The Bureau of Prisons reviewed the transfer and approved it. No exception was made for his age, his health condition, or his documented enemy status inside the federal system. Bulger arrived at USP Hazelton on the morning of October 29, 2018. He was processed, assigned a cell, and placed in the general population area of the facility. Prison protocol requires that high-profile or vulnerable inmates receive a threat assessment before general population placement. Now, whether that assessment was completed and what it concluded has never been made fully public. Within hours of his arrival, word spread through the facility exactly who had just walked through the door. In a prison already running on tension and gang structure, the arrival of one of the most notorious FBI informants in American history, a man whose cooperation had resulted in murders, was not going to pass without a response. On the morning of October 30th, 2018, less than 12 hours after Whitey Bulger arrived at USP Hazelton, correctional officers conducting a routine check found him unresponsive in his cell. He had been beaten with a padlock placed inside a sock, a weapon improvised specifically for blunt force killing. His eyes had been targeted. On his body showed the organized brutality of men who knew exactly what they were doing and why. 3 men were later charged in connection with his murder: Fodio's Freddie Gias, Paul DeCologero, and Sean McKinnon. Gias was a New England mob hitman, serving a life sentence for murder. DeCologero had connections to a criminal organization that had direct historical conflict with Bulger. The combination of men, motive, and method pointed clearly away from spontaneous violence and toward something coordinated. The federal investigation into his death raised questions that went far beyond 3 inmates with padlocks. How did men with documented connections to Bulger's enemies end up in the same facility? Why was Bulger transferred to one of the most dangerous federal prisons in the country at 89 years old? Who signed off on that transfer? And why, in a facility with surveillance cameras throughout, was the attack not captured in a way that produced cleaner answers? Bulger's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the federal government, arguing that the Bureau of Prisons had been negligent, or worse, in transferring him to Hazelton. The lawsuit alleged that prison officials knew he was in danger and transferred him anyway. The federal government disputed the claims. The full internal communications surrounding the transfer decision have never been released to the public. Whitey Bulger spent his entire life operating in the space between law and crime, using both sides against each other, surviving through intelligence and manipulation, and the willingness to destroy anyone who threatened him. He corrupted federal agents, ordered murders, evaded justice for 16 years, and walked into a courtroom at 83 years old and showed no emotion at 2 life sentences. The one thing that finally ended him was a transfer form signed by someone inside the same federal system he had spent decades corrupting. The men who killed him are already serving life sentences. They had nothing to lose. The FBI agent who protected him for years, John Connolly, died in prison in 2022, still serving a murder conviction. The 19 confirmed victims of Bulger's organization remain dead, and the full truth of what happened inside USP Hazelton on the night of October 29, 2018, who ordered it, who allowed it, and who benefited from it, remains officially unsolved. If you want to go deeper inside real stories like this one every single week, subscribe right now. And the next story is already being written, and it is just as dark as this one. Somewhere inside a federal archive, the transfer authorization that sent Whitey Bulger to USP Hazelton still exists, signed, dated, and stamped with the full authority of the United States Bureau of Prisons. Nobody has been held accountable for signing it. Nobody likely ever will. That is not a failure of the system. In this case, it may have been exactly how the system was designed to work.